Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and for some of you, nearly good night to all the connected participants. So I am Martial Bernou, officer of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. I am in the Climate and Environment Division, and I am the coordinator of one of the teams supporting countries in relation to agriculture sectors in the Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDCs. And this team is also facilitating a TFO, the Thematic Working Group on Agriculture, Food Security and Land Use under the umbrella of NDC partnership. So it's really my great pleasure to moderate this webinar focusing on opportunities to bridge science and policy for agriculture in the NDCs. Thus, a warm welcome to all of you. This webinar is organized by the Research Program on Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security, CCAFS, of the CGIAR, which is a global partnership that unite international organizations engaged in research about food security. We have also the Wageningen University and Research, or alias VOER, from the Netherlands. We have also the Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture, with the facilitation unit being hosted at FAO. So I will explain a little bit how we will proceed. Simon Leiva, the GACSA Coordinator, will provide us some opening remarks. And then we will have 3 speakers to share their views. But please note that also this webinar will be recorded and available afterwards on the GACSA platform, as well as the different PowerPoint. So the 3 panelists are Miss Elizabeth, alias Lizzie, Fred, from VOER and CCAF, Professor Roger Schulte, Chair of the Farming System Ecology Group of VOER, and Miss Dada Bokudo, an internationally well-known expert on climate policy and finance, land use, and climate smart agriculture. She's supporting and working for different international organizations, such as FAO also. Then at the end, we will have 20 minutes of exchanges where you can ask your question. So on the bottom of your screen, you have a Q&A box. So please use that one to put your different question. We will ensure that all the questions will be answered, even if not during the webinar, but at least in writing. And this will be also put together with a recording of the webinar. And we will also share with the participants the answer that we will provide. So with no much ado, let's give me the floor to Simon. Simon, the floor is yours, but yours for only 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Marcel. Good morning, all. My name is Simon Leiva. I'm the coordinator of the Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture. Welcome to all to our policy dialogue. Today, we will be discussing climate smart agriculture as an approach to reach the agricultural climate objective outlined in the NDCs. We will also showcase examples of effective projects, programs, or policies that help to build the bridge between agricultural policy and science, and considerations for policymakers to strengthen the presence of agriculture in the national level climate policies. In other words, the importance of a multi-stakeholder approach for policymakers working at the nexus of climate change and agriculture. So without further ado, this is just a very warm welcome to everyone, and I hope you all enjoy this session. Marshall, the virtual floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Also, thank you so much for respecting the time. It will hopefully allow a strong discussion at the end.
Yes, thank you.
So then let's start. First, Lizzie will guide us to explore how climate smart agriculture can be an approach to the implementation of agriculture sectors of the NDC. So Lizzie, you have a little bit more time than Simon. You deserve 10 to 12 minutes.
Okay,
so
thank you.
If you prefer, you share your screen or you can ask Ayla. It's up to you.
Yes, I can do it. Just give me 1 second. Okay.
Just before you start, when you ask question, please so say to the question to whom it is. So,
Marshall, can you see my screen?
I can see your screen, I can hear you, so it's perfect. Please.
Cool. Okay.
Proceed.
All right. Well, first of all, good morning from my side of the world. I'm in North America right now, so a little early for me still. But many thanks to GACSA and all the other facilitators for preparing this webinar. I'm really happy to participate. And I'm going to be sharing with you guys today my master thesis research that I did in collaboration with Farming Systems Ecology Group at Wageningen and CCAFS. So the research was looking at the role of climate smart agriculture in the implementation of the nationally determined contributions, which is quite a mouthful. And ultimately it resulted in some recommendations for policymakers around the integration of climate change and agricultural policy agendas, as Simon just said. So I believe that all of you are probably very familiar with the Paris Agreement and the impact and vulnerability of the agricultural sector on climate change, but I just want to quickly contextualize this presentation to the NDCs. So they're basically the medium for parties to the Paris Agreement to communicate their climate targets and what they need in order to reach these targets to the international community. And although these NDCs are all different and unique to the party that creates them, they include their greenhouse gas mitigation targets as well as adaptation targets to climate change. And most make a quite strong reference to agriculture. So they also have provided an opportunity for some countries to push agriculture a bit more in their climate agendas. Okay, so although there are still a lot of challenges with NDC implementation, and as you can see here, we are not actually on track to reach our targets. Previous research by Ross and Agostini has identified that most challenges and support needs with NDC implementation fall into a few categories, the first of which is technology transfer. And this is referring to support with anything between policy planning to technical assistance for agricultural practices. So the next is capacity building, and this includes needs such as developing sectoral adaptation plans, encouraging better stakeholder engagement, and trainings on best management practices for agriculture. So the last is financial support, and this is needed to help in both of the previous categories as well. So a lot of NDCs from the non-Annex 1 countries are conditional based on international climate finance support, and the 100 billion US dollars that were promised to them have not materialized yet. So that is a huge support need. So in the agricultural sector, one approach that's been identified as a pathway to reaching these targets that are outlined in the NDCs is climate smart agriculture, or CSA. So this approach aims to reach the co-benefits between adaptation and mitigation, as well as food production or productivity. And it's really aiming to improve livelihoods, to build resilience, and at the same time to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So obviously it's an approach that's very well aligned with the components of the NDCs that we just talked about. So since we already knew that CSA has been identified as a way to reach these climate targets outlined in the NDCs, the research that we did wasn't trying to prove its viability as an approach, but rather we were seeking to explore the extent to which it's actually used, as well as to identify additional entry points for its use in the implementation of the NDCs. So here is a visual representation of what this synergistic potential could actually look like. For the integration of the NDCs and CSA. And basically, as you can see here, it's using CSA as effectively as an approach, as an entry point for the NDCs, but then it's also using the NDCs as an entry point to encourage the uptake of CSA. So ultimately, we came up with some recommendations for policymakers that could help them to more fully integrate agriculture into the climate agendas, and then to use CSA, or at least the pillars that I just mentioned, as an approach to do so. So in order to do this, we decided to do 2 case studies, one in Ethiopia and one in Colombia. And we chose these countries because, number one, neither of them explicitly mentioned CSA in their NDCs. Number two, because CCAFS, who I was working with, has a robust presence in each, and thus it was easier to facilitate the research process. And then number three, because we felt that any commonalities that were found in these like very, very diverse contexts could potentially point to structural challenges that might be of use to other places as well. So the research followed an analysis framework that identifies challenges and solutions, or as they're called in the framework, gaps and bridges. And it does this through really strong stakeholder engagement, as Simon was just talking about. And so to this end, we conducted stakeholder analyses and interviews. So these are examples of the stakeholder maps that we created, which highlights the complexity of the social systems in each country at the nexus of climate change and agriculture. So the boxes that you see in color are the organizations and agencies that ultimately participated in our interviews. And we tried to have representation from the different levels and the different types of organizations. So we then conducted informational interviews, and we followed the semi-structured format that you see here, with a total of 30 people, 15 from each country. And then we synergized and analyzed these patterns that we found in the data that we collected with a qualitative data analysis software. So first I'm going to show you how the gaps or the challenges that we identified were organized. So the three main categories that I made were capacity building, engagement, and funding. So obviously you're probably noticing that these are similar to the challenges associated with NDC implementation that I touched on before that were identified by Ross and Agostini, except for that I ended up combining technology transfer into capacity building and then further identified engagement as a gap, which I will go into in a second. So within the capacity building code, I identified the subcategories of data management, technical capacity, which is where the technology transfer bit from Ross and Agostini comes in, and then also extension and research. So for engagement, the subcategories were horizontal and vertical coordination. And horizontal coordination can refer to, for example, coordination between sectors, or between different types of institutions that have different purposes but work at the same level, such as a national governmental ministry versus a national research organization. And then vertical coordination refers to the alignment of different levels of government, such as international, national, regional, and local. So the effective coordination of these types can encourage collaboration and efficient use of resources, while some misalignment can actually exacerbate the other challenges and gaps. And then for funding, the subcategories were international and national. And the actual codes that fit into all of these differed slightly in the two countries, but they showed a lot of similarities as well. I unfortunately don't have enough time to go through all of the codes in great detail, but I'm just gonna highlight a few that I think are especially interesting. So the most widely perceived gap in each country, I'll just try to blow it up, was horizontal coordination. Which I just described to you. So informants in both countries explained that this lack of alignment has led to the duplication of projects. And they expressed that this often means that resources, which are in general already in scarce supply, are not necessarily used as efficiently as they could be. Another interesting finding was that in both countries, they expressed a challenge in using the CSA approach because they find that sometimes it can lack a cohesive message. And although some people think that this can actually be a strength because it allows for flexibility in adapting to different situations and using whichever of the pillars fit best, it also has made some people quite confused about who's supposed to be doing what and how that can be measured. So funding in general is an issue in both countries, but especially in Ethiopia, the key informants were experiencing challenges around climate finance in the agriculture sector because, as I said previously, the funding that they've been promised by the international community just hasn't materialized. And then lastly, in the capacity building category, both really highlighted the need for better data management and knowledge sharing systems, which are also related to the horizontal coordination and funding. Number one, because these data management systems could help to share information about projects between sectors or organizations and then cut back on some of the duplication that I talked about, but also because measuring impact is really important in order to demonstrate what they're doing on the ground to donors and ultimately to help them allocate some more resources. Okay, so now that you have been inundated by the challenges and gaps, which are not quite so positive, I want to quickly just walk through some of the solutions or bridges, as we called them in the framework, to close these gaps that were identified through the interviews and what this means for recommendations for policymakers in the bigger picture. So the three main bridge categories that were consistently identified by the actors in Ethiopia and Colombia were creation of platforms, effective national strategies, and climate smart agriculture as an approach. So these refer to categories of solutions that each country is pursuing in order to effectively integrate climate work into their agricultural agendas, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the bridges have reached their full potential. According to the key informants, many times these bridges are actually still gaps, but they represent some priority areas for improvement. So in both countries, CSA as an approach was the most frequently mentioned bridge category, and they basically described that CSA has been or could be used in their countries as an approach to strengthen the linkage of climate and agriculture. In Ethiopia, they especially highlighted that CSA has been useful as an approach to the planning process because, for example, whereas previously they had maybe focused exclusively on increasing production, now using CSA as an approach to some of their project planning, they also try to think like, okay, how can we also incorporate adaptation here and build resilience? So even if not all of the pillars of CSA are being achieved, working towards the triple benefits that we talked about before has been useful to them. And actually, they've created a mainstreaming strategy so that the Ministry of Agriculture can get their partners on board and standardize its usage a little bit. And they think that maybe ultimately this can help them to access more climate finance and to improve some of that horizontal and vertical coordination. So next is effective national strategies, and this refers to the use of successful frameworks, policies, plans, etc., at the national scale. And this was the least prevalent bridge category that was perceived in Colombia compared to the second most prevalent in Ethiopia. And I think that this accurately reflects how different the national climate strategies in the two countries are. So in Colombia, one person described that although their climate change strategy was established with the right objectives in mind, that it ultimately has led to frameworks upon frameworks, which basically overwhelmed everyone with information to the point that they actually didn't know who was supposed to do what. Versus in Ethiopia, almost every single one of the key informants that I spoke with spoke very highly of their overarching CRG or climate resilient green economy strategy. And then this has been a really effective strategy in integrating different sectors and actors. And now, at least in my conversations, it was pretty much used synonymously with their NDC. So the creation of platforms refers to effective platforms that bring together different sectors, stakeholders, levels of governments, et cetera. And then in Colombia, people generally felt that they had good intentions with their platforms, but that there are too many of them and that people aren't really aware of what the purpose of each is. And then in Ethiopia, they actually felt that they didn't have enough platforms and that they still needed more in order to integrate different levels of organization or different levels and types of organizations. So they haven't reached quite that sweet spot yet. Okay. So the Paris Agreement had a different effect in different contexts. In Colombia, for example, the key informants felt that if the international community hadn't prioritized climate work, that it probably wouldn't be such a high priority on their national policy agendas. In Ethiopia, this was not so much the case. The key informants there thought that their own CRG strategy, which I just mentioned, has been way more important and impactful to their policy development than the Paris Agreement has been. That being said, they did in both countries think that the formulation of the NDCs, the actual formulation of them and using them as sort of a guiding light for climate change policy development has been very helpful. And I think this sort of reiterates the synergistic potential here of not only using CSA as an approach to implementing the NDCs, but also using the NDCs as an entry point to strengthening CSA uptake. So the main opportunities that people felt came from the NDCs are in regards to capacity building, funding or receiving of these international funds, organization of projects, or in other words, including climate more heavily in their agricultural policy, and coordination, which basically is saying that it's given them the opportunity to sort of bring the objectives and responsibilities of different sectors and organizations into one document. So I just want to bring all of this back together and leave you with a couple of take-home messages. This figure represents some of the recommended processes and considerations from our case studies. And like I said before, these two countries are so incredibly different, but the idea here is that perhaps some of the commonalities that we found, which I just spoke about, could be of use to other countries as well. So I want to reiterate here that we did find that CSA can be a useful approach to NDC implementation, but that the processes of identifying these gaps in the actors and the bridges can be a useful approach if they want to strengthen the use of CSA, because especially through the strong stakeholder engagement, policymakers can gain a much deeper understanding of their policy environment before they dive in, and make sure that the entry points for CSA are contextualized to their unique situations. So if we look over the bridges again, I just want to reiterate that they are a really good starting point, we think, to help to create this enabling environment for the integration of climate change into the agricultural sector, and then ultimately to hopefully reach this synergistic potential with CSA and the NDCs. So I think I'm probably already at time, if not over. So I'm going to stop there. But thanks again, and I look forward to questions at the end. And I will stop my share now.
Okay, thank you so much. So just remembering to the participant, if you have questions, put in the Q&A box. So thanks so much, Elizabeth, showing that there is a really evidences that there is a clear role for CSA as an approach to build bridge to implement NDCs. But now we have the evidence. Let's explore with our second presenter, Professor Roger Schulte, how to integrate effectively agriculture into climate policy. So Roger, same rule apply to you, 10 to 12 minutes. Thank you. I can see your screen.
You can hear me and you can see my screen?
Perfect.
Very good. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roger Schulte. I'm Chair of the Farming Systems Ecology. And thank you, Lizzie, for this fantastic introduction. And I'd like to approach the same topic from the opposite direction. A very peculiar part of the discussion on agriculture within the climate change agenda is that there is a very big difference between what we call the point of obligation and the point of initiative. So point of obligation in the climate agenda is the individual parties, so the individual countries, the governments who sign up to a particular contribution. Whereas the point of initiative, where does the action take place? Where do the changes take place? That takes place at farm level, at very small scale local level by tens of millions of farmers worldwide. Now, I would like to approach the same topic from this point of initiative upwards, so starting at the farm level. And let me start with one example where, if my presentation wants to move on. Let me bring you to Ethiopia, where we work in the Atsbi catchment, and you see a little video of it here. It is a catchment when you drive there in the north of Ethiopia, actually drive through a very semi-arid area, moon-like landscape prone to erosion. And when you enter this catchment, suddenly you literally enter this green oasis. And that is the result of communities, policymakers, and scientists working together for the last 20 years to restore this landscape. And it's one example of climate smart agriculture in that it's not only being productive and reducing emissions, but also more resilient to climate change itself. Now, have they done that? They've done it by coming together and to make bylaws and local agreements with the community and the policymakers. For example, they agreed not to graze any of the steep slopes and to fence those off. And instead, how can they create value from the land on these slopes? They did that by putting down honey hives and producing honey. And they built a honey factory together in the middle of the valley. And they're now a major exporting of honey. And of course, for a remote area, that's a good use of land, because honey is a high value, low volume product. And on one, you can export a lot of value on one truck. Also, they put in check dams to combat the erosion and to fill up the gullies, and that way they created new farmland, and they created bylaws on who could use this farmland, and they even thought of the landless farmers to give them a role, and they were put in charge of the nursery stock for the rest of the farmers can purchase. So here's an example of how people come together, how policymakers and science and the community can work together to regenerate a landscape. Now, that's one example, and we're working not only in Ethiopia, but in many countries across the world, where we use this as an example for other communities, what can be achieved. And in our experience, the best way to get people together is to get them together around a case study. And you see some examples. Here we use maps, or we use fuzzy cognitive maps, or on the top left in Ireland, we actually use the physical model of a landscape. And we get people together to design these different landscapes in the world we want, and then also a discussion on how we can get there. Now, from that, we actually record everything that's being discussed, and you can actually publish scientific papers on that. And this is one of our papers by Lillian, Bridging the Think-Do Gap on Functional Land Management using a multi-stakeholder science policy interface. And very briefly, if I sum up what we've learned from all these case studies around the world, the first thing that jumps out is that if we talk with different stakeholders, be they farmers, policymakers, green NGOs, advisory services, industry, if we talk about the world that we want, it's actually surprising how quickly we all agree. We all kind of want the same thing. We want a world that produces food, and at the same time combats climate change, and at the same time fosters biodiversity. We all want the same. Where the disagreement starts is how to get there. And do we do this with taxes? Do we do it with subsidies? Is it mandatory? Is it voluntary? Is it market-led? Is it consumer-led? That is where the disagreements between the different actors take place. And I'll come back to that. The third thing we've learned is that climate is one of many objectives that the different actors have. Actors are concerned about climate, but they're also concerned about their income. They're concerned about biodiversity. They're concerned about water, and they're concerned about social issues. And of course, they're all integrated. And then this links back to the horizontal coordination that Lizzie mentioned, where it has to be part of one package of land management. And the fourth item we learned is that discussions on land management, in these discussions, often the discussion on priorities, on the competing priorities from different stakeholders, gets muddled by discussions on facts. For example, one party may say, I propose that we should minimum tillage in this landscape because that will increase the carbon in the soil. And then the other party may say, well, in our country, it doesn't actually increase carbon in our soil. And we get a discussion between priorities and facts, and that can muddle the clarity of the debate. Now, keeping these four lessons that we've learned in mind on the science policy interface, we set to work to create one of those platforms that Lizzie mentioned, to get people together on transition, to agree on transition pathways. And here we are. We start our journey with the use of models, because the use of models can help us separate the facts from the priorities. And one model we're using a lot, you see here on the screen, is the farm design model. It's what we call a broad and shallow model that connects all aspects of land management. So it connects, for example, the household nutritional requirements to productivity, to the animal requirements, labor requirements, farm economics, greenhouse gas emissions, water quality, and it allows us to do what-if scenarios. If I introduce legumes on this farm, what will this do to my farm economics? What will this do to the animal nutrient requirements, etc.? That also allows us to design farm and landscape management scenarios. And I've got an example here on the right-hand side, where we see two objectives, in this case, farm profitability and habitat, the amount of habitat on the farm, but you can choose whatever variables you want to optimize. That could be nutritional diversity or erosion prevention. And here we see the original farm configuration. And then the model can optimize, and of course, the ideal situation is here, with where the yellow star is. That's the sweet spot, where we can't get there because of trade-offs between our objectives. The model doesn't provide one optimum value, it provides multiple optimum values. The users remain in charge of the world they want to see, and you can click on the different solutions that the model has come up with. Now, I won't dwell on that. We have applied this model worked with local communities in many countries around the world. And it really works to bring the stakeholders together. But one drawback is that the output of the model still looks like this. Now, this means quite a bit to you and I as scientists. We can visualize what this means in the landscape, but many other actors in the debate, it doesn't make any sense what this means. So now we've come up with a new visualization of the model where we actually, and I hope you can see this video, where we actually project a holographic landscape at a workshop on the table. So this is not virtual reality, it's actually mixed reality, where the stakeholder, the participants in the workshop can still see each other, they can still have a discussion, but in the middle here we see a landscape together that we can design. And here we see two users. In fact, I think it's Lizzie herself that is changing the land use on some of the fields here, and thus designing the landscape that we want. Now, the model then in real time feeds back what the implications for this of this changed land use is for greenhouse gas emissions, for soil carbon, for the nutrients, etc. Here you see an updating of the results. Now, all of this fits in a rucksack. You can take it around the world. It's a number of HoloLenses and one server that we bring with us, and you don't even need the internet to run it. So we can run it in remote communities. This is the latest version, and here you see how we can compare the different land uses. Here we see the different bars that you see here are the different criteria that we look at, the different objectives, for example, the farm income or the soil carbon. And then we can compare the reality here, the last row, the value of each of these variables that are out there in reality, the value of our initial plan, then the improvement of the individual user as compared to the previous land use by that user, and the target range that we try to get each of the variables in. Now, you can imagine that this takes a little bit of training and getting used to. In cases where we feel that this is too much to ask from, say, smallholder farmers or particular stakeholders to get used to this technology, we also have a more classical two-dimensional classroom setting in which we can do the same. So where each stakeholder can design their own landscape and then can be discussed afterwards. Now, finally, one example back to Ethiopia, how we're now implementing that. We're working with GIZ, the German Development Corporation, which has many programs with the Ethiopian government for multiple objectives. For example, for restoring land, improving productivity, jobs and income, nutritional security, but also indeed issues relating to land tenure, land use planning, and community assets. Now, here we're applying that, and how do we do that? First, we build a digital landscape using satellite imagery that's available. This is classical GIS, where we build all these layers into our interactive landscape lab. Now, then the second step that we're working on at the moment is to identify the key actors in this land management, and this is where Lizzie will be working for the next year, and to bring them to the table to design this communal land management plan. And this is where we use our interactive landscape lab. First of all, the participants identify what are the objectives that are important to them in this landscape. For example, it could be they want to minimize or maximize the prevention of erosion, or they want to maximize farm income, or they want to maximize nutritional diversity, or all of the above at the same time. Now, the model allows us to calculate the historic pathway, and then we come together and of course, the model can project what would happen in absence of a land management plan. And then we come together around the table to design a new land management plan that the stakeholders agree on. And finally, then we use the satellite imagery again for our to track progress against the land management plan and against the baseline projection, and that will be visualized in our dashboard for monitoring of all these variables. Now, this is one example where we try to address the challenges that we've come across, so to disentangle the discussion on competing priorities from the discussion on facts. The model delivers the facts, and then all we have left to discuss is to discuss the competing objectives of different actors. We have integrated climate into a wider set of objectives for landscape management, and we also, it allows us to have a discussion on transition pathways, how to get where we want. And with that, I finish my presentation.
Thank you so much. I really like the 4 points that on the first one, we agree on the world we want, but I hope your tool will provide us the way to tackle the second one at least. Okay, so we will go back to this and the discussion, but first let's, so we have seen two examples mostly from Latin America and Africa. Now we will move with Dada on South Asia. So Dada, the floor is you. I hope really that you, and I'm quite sure your example will be as interesting as the other example we have seen. So you have 12 minutes also. We can see your screen.
I am muted. You can see the screen? Okay.
No, we can hear you, so please.
All right. So thank you very much for having me in this wonderful sharing. I would like to take everyone now to the Southeast Asian region and show you just an example of the nexus of agriculture within NDCs and networks, and the use of linking networks with policymakers and the scientists. So most of you are aware, my mouse always does this. Okay, most of you are aware probably of the region. We are mostly impacted by the impacts of climate change, and the population has a heavy reliance on agriculture, fisheries, forestry, and other natural resources. It threatens our agriculture production and food security. And so therefore, this is a fact that is not denied by the highest level of ASEAN policymakers, which are mostly in this case, the ASEAN Ministers of Agriculture and Forestry. And so policy measures were put in place. You can see it in the economic blueprint for 2025 and the vision and strategic plan for ASEAN cooperation in food, agriculture, and forestry will also be monitored and assessed at the end of 2020-25. Most of the focus, we're really looking at national and regional adaptation measures to increase the resilience of the region's agriculture sector. This was at the early part when these policies were being implemented. And if some of you know how ASEAN works, it's different from the European Union. These policy measures are nothing if it's not considered together with a range of practices and technologies. So, as explained, sometime in, I think, 2014, the term climate smart agriculture came into being coined, although of course we are all aware that some of the practices are already being implemented on the ground. At that time, it was actually GIZ who helped support the ASEAN into adopting the concept, the three-pillared concept of CSA as an approach in looking at food security for the region. So From 2014, we have undergone several, looking at reviews, what are the best practices in the area that promotes the 3 pillars of CSA, what's going on, what are the people, what are our farmers doing. We found like a variety of practices, such as there's the promotion of stress-tolerant varieties resistant to drought, salinity, pests, and diseases. You know, we're the biggest rice-eating region in the world, I suppose. So a lot of the member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations have been really looking at rice, stress-tolerant varieties for rice. Then there's also improved crop management measures during crop growth and development, use of technological advances and science-based knowledge, crop diversification. And there are some innovations such as agri-insurance and cropping calendar. So we found that at the beginning of the coining of the term CSA, these were some of the existent practices. And then when the INDCs started being reformulated into NDCs, it was really FAO Regional Asia Pacific Office within the region looked at what are the priority actions for all the 10 countries of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. What's coming out in the NDCs as being considered coming from the agriculture sector. And here that was done by, a lot of it done by Bo Damen. And in his review, he saw that there's priority actions for the NDCs were improved and more resilient crop varieties, efficient irrigation, better animal and fisheries management, enhanced fertilizers, a lot of potentials in greenhouse gas mitigation, and then also recommendations for strength institutions and planning processes. The next one, like Vietnam, they very much specified what they're going to consider into their NDCs coming from the agriculture sector. For example, alternate wetting and drying has the potential both for all the 3 pillars that were a part of CSA. Then system of rice intensification, changing crop patterns, and nitrogen uses. From a regional perspective, from the 10 countries, how do we see NDCs? When we looked at and when we had a review of the 10 countries NDCs, we see that really looking at the NDCs could also provide opportunities for regional collaboration, especially on looking at common technical focuses on forestry, water management, climate planning and policy, disaster risk reduction, resilient crop production. These were like the technical issues that were providing opportunities for regional collaboration. And so how else do we promote this, and that how else do we utilize NDCs? I think one of the best practice that came out from our region was the establishment of this network that was coming from actually they were founded by the ministry's focal points to ASEAN, or ministry's Department of Agriculture Research. And they launched this network with support from GIZ and FAO to ensure adaptation of the agriculture sector to climate change and optimize its mitigation potential. As several work areas that you can see at the bottom. And it acts as a platform to strengthen regional cooperation, provide evidence-based policy recommendations, very importantly, mobilize resources and build partnerships, involve inclusive partnerships with stakeholders, and the network continuously promote not just CSA, but also its potential to contribute to the NDCs through the utilization of networks such as the Global Alliance on Climate Smart Agriculture. And thank you for having our sharing today. There's also the APEC Climate Center, the Climate Services for Resilient Development, of course, GIZ, FAO, the CGIAR, and specifically the CCAFS program. This is when we really see when both 2014, I think, was a critical time for agriculture, because it's when CSA came out, then the CCAFS program came out, and also the ASEAN Climate Resilience Network came out. And we thought when we were reaching to the scientists of the CGIAR group, of which CCAFS were there, we were also saying that it makes sense that we partner. We are coming from the policymakers of the 10 countries of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and they have the science behind them. And it has since then been a very fruitful collaboration with many outputs and achievements. But one that I would like to mention at this point is that this platform, this dialogue platform, or this regional exchange platform, gave birth to what we call the Asean Negotiation Group for Agriculture. Because at some point I think in 2016, there was a realization that you can promote CSA in practices all you want here, but affecting policy at the multilateral environmental agreement level, such as the UNFCCC, the negotiators are not really the agriculture sector. So one of the achievements is really to give birth to what we call the negotiation group, training the agriculture sector or the formerly merely agriculture researchers into climate policy negotiation. It was I think it's such a trip. We are writing a history of how this all came about, but it was a very exciting times for our agriculture sector to be involved with climate policy negotiations. But it took a lot of efforts and also needed a lot of support in order for us to arrive at where we are now. So how does this negotiation group work? Actually, it looks at the NDCs and look at the commonalities of the NDCs as a basis for regional dialogue and joint submissions to the UNFCCC. So in 2016, we very much like newborn babies into UNFCCC processes, submitted a joint submission to the 44th SABSTA meeting of the UNFCCC. We didn't know how to do this. We had to work and reach out with the seasoned climate change negotiators. And these submissions onwards, there was also there was also coincidentally the landmark decision on agriculture from the UNFCCC called the Coronivia Joint Work on Agriculture. And we again engaged with that through common positions. All 10 countries agreed that these are going to be priority areas on CSAs and that needed scaling up, and it is based on the NDCs of the countries. And then also in 2019, finally, the group was recognized negotiating under G77 in China. It was very politically visible because it was also a group full of laughing people because they're quite new to negotiations. So they're quite visibly together during, especially in Madrid. So these were, I think, very good examples of the conceptual presentations from earlier of CSA, NDCs, and networks. Here are some examples of our submissions to SABSTA 44. This is the first ever submission of 10 countries from the agriculture sector jointly to UNFCCC. And then several submissions to the Coronivia Joint Work on Agriculture. There's our views on identification and assessment of agricultural practices and technologies, but considering the differences in agroecological zones and farming systems within the 10 countries. So it has different levels of challenges, knowing that there are different ecological zones. So where are we now? I wouldn't deal with the main institutional challenges for scaling up all these CSA practices. We are at the point, and you will probably see this slide presentation later and look at our challenges. I think that our challenges in promoting and scaling up CSAs can be mirrored in other regions. What I wanted to share right now is we are at the point where we felt like we reached certain success in engaging the sector into climate policy. we are now at a point where we are really now looking for financing all these common positions from the region. So we are engaged at the moment in looking for a multi-country or an ASEAN proposal to the GCF that will hopefully see the implementation of the Coronavia submissions that the 10 countries have given. At the same time, provide agriculture economic investments that will attract investors and reach us to the promised land of scaling up all the needs and demands that had been identified through this whole processes of promoting climate smart agriculture in the region. We hope that all of the efforts of reviewing the CSA practices would also encourage the incorporation of contributions of the CSAs into the NDCs. Several countries, because we are 10 member countries, there are different levels of NDC and CSA alignment and embeddedness. I think, I don't want to mention certain countries, but certain countries, okay, let's say Vietnam, Indonesia, maybe they lead this into integration of CSA practices as really giving a compelling contribution to their NDCs. I think I will end my presentation at that point. At that point, after successful climate policy work of the agriculture sector, we are now at this juncture, we are looking at common ways to access finance jointly to ensure that there is scaling up of the demands that have been identified. And so, Marshall, this is it from we hope that you can visit us in the region, and this is how we do networking and knowledge exchange events.
So, thank you so much, Dada, and indeed a really nice place for networking. I guess it's Bali. So thank you so much.
This is Philippines, actually.
Okay. So I just ask you to stop sharing the screens for the participant to see all the different panelists. I will not summarize the two presentation. We have a few minutes in front of us. I guess we have already, so first I really want to thank all the panelists and the presenter, because it was really showing a lot of, not only the gap, but that we can tackle the gap, and that there is already a lot ongoing, showing us the right direction. And hopefully we will answer the first question that was put on the screen by Roger, that we will be able to implement the world we want. So I will start with you, Roger, because there is two questions I will combine into one. It's mostly concerning your tool that you are presenting. There is, how do you determine price of inputs and output? Basically, all the tool works on if people can also change that eventually. Yeah. And also a question is forestry also embedded in that tool?
Yeah, very good question. The tool that we use comes with a standard library of values for different parts of the world for the different variables. And then when we apply it in a certain context, with those book values can be overwritten by the values you measure or you input. And that depends on really the objective of what you're trying to optimize. I give one example. One of the book values that's in there is the phosphorus content of each crop. Now, if your study is on the scarcity or losses of phosphorus, then you want to override that value. You want to go measure it and override it in your model because it's important to you. But if your study is on nutritional diversity or carbon storage in the soil, then you may choose to spend your time measuring other variables in situ and use the book values for that phosphorus content, for example. So that's flexible. The second question in relation to the agroforestry, absolutely, we increasingly see the value of agroforestry to meet many objectives. We are working on it in the model. We've done a pilot study in the Atlantic rainforest in Brazil, where we're working with successional agroforestry systems. In terms of modeling, agroforestry is challenging to measure because of you're working with multiple crops, with multiple cycles on the one land parcel. So in terms of modeling, there is technical challenges there, but we've piloted it successfully, and it's we actually have a PhD student working on that to bring that into not only the modeling, but also our thinking process.
Okay, thank you so much. So I understand it's a really a full landscape approach.
Yeah.
On wall to wall, I would say, all the land, and also that users have always some proposition of input, but they can always bypass this with their own number. So it's really interesting.
Correct.
I have a question for Elizabeth. So remembering that you can still put your question on the Q&A box. So it's from Zurich Polytechnic University. What can constitute some practical incentive for the different sector to actually make use of new platform for horizontal coordination? So there is basically a common, just after, a bridge alone is not a guarantee that people will make use of it.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that question. As Rahir knows about me, I'm sort of a practical thinker myself, trying to make sure that these things are actually going to be picked up. I want to preface it with, I don't necessarily think that new platforms are the way to go here. That's why I'm saying that the process of really observing what's existing and what's happening in the policy space is a good place to start. It might be that there are already some very, very useful platforms that could be integrated together or collaborate that could then have more of a streamlined approach. So just with that caveat being said, I think when I was reading this, I think that one pretty tangible example that I experienced in my conversations with people in Ethiopia specifically is that they have the CRG facility, which is basically where all climate-related finance channels through for their climate resilient green economy strategy. And I think that that's a really effective example of how it incentivizes this collaboration, because there's representation from all the line ministries in that conversation to make sure that all sectors have a voice and where the climate finance that is coming into the country can then be dispersed. And then on top of that, it also includes an advisory group of different actors in the country. So people from the private sector are involved, civil society, development partners, etc. And I think the sort of practical mentality there is that the incentive comes from this climate finance is coming in, and then people want to be able to have a voice of how that's going to be allocated. And so that's, for me, in my opinion, that's one practical incentive. That being said, I think that's a really, really good question and would probably merit some further research. So I don't have necessarily all the answers to that, but that's where I would start. And first of all, like I said in the beginning, just to reiterate that that first making sure, like in Ethiopia and Colombia, it was quite interesting to see that they both felt that they hadn't reached a sweet spot. So if there are existing platforms, to make sure that they're collaborating, and then otherwise to maybe create new if there aren't. Okay. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you so much. Very last question and answer briefly, because we are already running over time. It was mostly on the chat discussion. There was some aspect. I invite all of you to read, but just picking off from one point from Ada and asking Dada, because Dada, your network was created on resilience. On the intervention, yeah. there was a point on link to that. Basically, how to ensure that that the risk is part of the discussion. I'm simplifying the question. The question is more on that, but basically there is an important aspect on how to ensure that farmer can offset their risk. And I guess the ASEAN CRN network were discussing that.
Yeah, well, as you know, we are That's not the question I asked you to ask me, but I have an answer. Well, you know, it is actually a very critical discussion because, as I said, let's start with we are very new to negotiation. As it's the first time the agriculture sector was able to speak for itself. And on common positions. So each countries have varying levels of positions as well. So, and the position of ASEAN is under G77 in China, where it, let's say, mitigation is considered as an adaptation benefit and not an imposition to farmers. No, not that it shouldn't be an expensive venture and a very technological approach for demand for farmers to measure their carbon. But slowly, as you can see, there is a realization among some countries within the ASEAN that we might be missing some mitigation potential by not really looking at some CSA practices that actually lowers greenhouse gas emissions, for example, and there are some best practices that are coming out. So, but the bottom line here is that we actually do not ask the farmers to measure their carbon capture and their emissions. It's broken down into very simple terms that won't cost them anything at all. So it is actually an adaptation co-benefit that would come out from the region.
Okay, so what I will retain from that, and also from the comment on the chat, that really, I guess the most important point for you, for all stakeholders, and also for negotiators, that is what also Roger was mentioning, that we have different, it's not only one objective, some really multiple objectives that we need to tackle. And for farmer, risks are certainly important, not also for farmers, so for countries as a whole, as the COVID pandemic is also remembering quite well that. So risk is important. Adaptation for most developing countries is a top priority, but remembering that what GACSA is promoting, the climate smart agriculture, as an approach, we have also opportunity to tackle on the mitigation dimension that is really important. We have to stop here, unfortunately. I can see that it was starting to have a lot of discussion. We will provide a document after that webinar where we will put all the different questions, all the different comments also we have on the chat. And we will try to answer from the speakers, and with support with the GACSA facilitation unit, we'll try to answer to all of your comments and questions. I want to thank all of you, attendees and speakers. What I want to say also that several people were asking the presentation. The presentation and the recording of the webinar will be available afterward on the GACSA platform, so stay tuned. You will have all the material online. And for sure, you are free to directly ask the different presenters if you want to have more detail, more insight, on eventually to be present in another webinar for them to present their fantastic work. Elizabeth, I hope that your master is available also, that for participants to be able to read the full presentation.
Yeah, we're working on that.
Okay. Oh, great. So that's it. Thanks to all of you. Thanks all the organization, CCAFS, WUR, and GACSA for having organized that really interesting webinar. And I've seen that we had online a lot of all different stakeholders. We have people from NGOs, from negotiators, from countries. We have also private sector. So it was really interesting to have all that mixture, because what I can just learn from all your three presentations, we really need to exchange, to share experiences, trying to find among the different pathways we are fighting, to find the one that, or the ones, because there is no one size fits all, but the different one we can implement in the country, really. So thank you, all of you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Are we staying here?
No, I guess